The City on Mallington Moor by Lord Dunsany. Besides the old shepherd at Lingwold, whose habits render him unreliable, I am probably the only person that has ever seen the city on Mallington Moor. I had decided one year to do no London season, partly because of the ugliness of the things in the shops, partly because of the unresisted invasions of German bands, partly, perhaps, because some pet parrots in the oblong where I lived had learned to imitate cab whistles, but chiefly because of late there had seized me in London a quite unreasonable longing for large woods and waste spaces, while the very thought of little valleys underneath copses full of bracken and foxgloves was a torment to me, and every summer in London the longing grew worse, till the thing was becoming intolerable. So I took a stick and a knapsack and began walking northwards, starting at Tetherington and sleeping at inns where one could get real salt and the waiter spoke English, and where one had a name instead of a number, and though a tablecloth might be dirty, the windows opened so that the air was clean, where one had the excellent company of farmers and men of the wold, who could not be thoroughly vulgar because they had not the money to be so, even if they had wished it. At first the novelty was delightful, and then one day, in a queer old inn up Uthering way, beyond Lingwold, I heard for the first time the rumour of the city said to be on Mallington Moor. They spoke of it quite casually over their glasses of beer, two farmers at the inn. "They say the queer folk be at Mallington with their city," one farmer said. "Travelling they seem to be," said the other. And more came in then, and the rumour spread. And then such are the contradictions in our little likes and dislikes, and all the whims that drive us, that I, who had come so far to avoid cities, had a great longing all of a sudden for throngs again, and the great hives of man. And then and there determined on that bright Sunday morning to come to Mallington, and there search for the city that rumour spoke of so strangely. Mallington Moor, from all they said of it, was hardly a likely place to find a thing by searching. It was a huge, high moor, very bleak and desolate, and altogether trackless. It seemed a lonely place from what they said. The Normans, when they came, had called it Mallew, and afterwards Mallintown, and so it changed to Mallington. Though what a town can ever have had to do with a place so utterly desolate, I do not know. And before that, some say that the Saxons called it Bapras, which I believe to be a corruption of bad place. And beyond the mere rumour of a beautiful city, all of white marble, and with a foreign look, up on Mallington Moor, beyond this I could not get. None of them had seen it himself, only heard of it like, and my questions, rather than stimulating conversation, would always stop it abruptly. I was no more fortunate on the road to Mallington until Tuesday, when I was quite near it. I had been walking 2 days from the inn where I had heard the rumour, and could see the great hill steep as a headland on which Mallington lay, standing up on the skyline. The hill was covered with grass, where anything grew at all, but Mallington Moor is all heather. It is just marked Moor on the map. Nobody goes there, and they do not trouble to name it. It was there where the gaunt hill first came into sight, by the roadside, as I inquired for the marble city of some labourers by the way, that I was directed, partly I think in derision, to the old shepherd of Lingwold. It appeared that he, following sometimes sheep that had strayed, and wandering far from Lingwold, came sometimes up to the edge of Mallington Moor, and that he would come back from these excursions and shout through the villages, raving of a city of white marble and gold-tipped minarets, and hearing me asking questions of the city, they had laughed and directed me to the shepherd of Lingwold. One well-meant warning they gave me as I went: the old man was not reliable. And late that evening I saw the thatches of Lingwold sheltering under the edge of that huge hill, that Atlas-like, held up those miles of moor to the great winds and heaven. They knew less of the city in Lingwold than elsewhere, but they knew the whereabouts of the man I wanted, though they seemed a little ashamed of him. There was an inn at Lingwold that gave me shelter, whence in the morning, equipped with purchases, I set out to find their shepherd. And there he was on the edge of Mallington Moor, standing motionless, gazing stupidly at his sheep. His hands trembled continually, and his eyes had a blear look, but he was quite sober, wherein all Lingwold had wronged him. And then and there I asked him of the city, and he said he had never heard tell of any such place. And I said, Come, you must pull yourself together. And he looked angrily at me. But when he saw me draw from amongst my purchases a full bottle of whiskey and a big glass, he became more friendly. As I poured out the whiskey, I asked him again about the marble city on Mallington Moor, but he seemed quite honestly to know nothing about it. The amount of whiskey he drank was quite incredible, but I seldom expressed surprise, and once more I asked him the way to the wonderful city. His hand was steadier now, and his eyes more intelligent, and he said that he had heard something of such a city, but his memory was evidently blurred, and he was still unable to give me useful directions. I consequently gave him another tumbler, which he drank off like the first without any water, and almost at once he was a different man. The trembling in his hands stopped altogether. His eye became as quick as a younger man's. He answered my questions readily and frankly, and, what was more important to me still, his old memory became alert and clear for even minutest details. His gratitude to myself I need not mention, for I make no pretense that I bought the bottle of whiskey that the old shepherd enjoyed so much without at least some thought of my own advantage. Yet it was pleasant to reflect that it was due to me that he had pulled himself together and steadied his shaking hand and cleared his mind, recovered his memory and his self-respect. He spoke to me quite clearly, no longer slurring his words. He had seen the city first one moonlight night, when he was lost in the mist on the big moor. He had wandered afar in the mist, and when it lifted, he saw the city by moonlight. He had no food, but luckily had his flask. There never was such a city, not even in books. Travellers talked sometimes of Venice, seen from the sea. There might be such a place, or there might not, but whether or no, it was nothing to the city on Mallington Moor. Men who read books had talked to him in his time, hundreds of books, but they could never tell of any city like this. Why, the place was all of marble, roads, walls, and palaces, all pure white marble, and the tops of the tall thin spires were entirely of gold. And they were queer folk in the city, even for foreigners, and there were camels, but I cut 'em short, for I thought I could judge for myself, if there was such a place, and if not, I was wasting my time as well as a pint of good whiskey. So I got him to speak of the way, and after more circumlocution than I needed, and more talk of the city, he pointed to a tiny track on the black earth just beside us, a little twisty way you could hardly see. I said the moor was trackless, untrodden of man or dog it certainly was, and seemed to have less to do with the ways of man than any waste I have ever seen. But the track the old shepherd showed me, if track it was no more than the track of a hare, an elf path, the old man called it. Heaven knows what he meant. And then, before I left him, he insisted on giving me his flask with the queer strong rum it contained. Whiskey brings out in some men melancholy, in some rejoicing. With him it was clearly generosity, and he insisted until I took his rum, though I did not mean to drink it. It was lonely up there, he said, and bitter cold, and the city hard to find, being set in a hollow, and I should need the rum, and he had never seen the marble city except on days when he had had his flask. He seemed to regard that rusted iron flask as a sort of mascot, and in the end I took it. I followed that odd, faint track on the black earth under the heather till I came to a big grey stone beyond the horizon, where the track divides into two, and I took the one to the left as the old man told me. I knew by another stone that I saw far off that I had not lost my way, nor the man lied. And just as I hoped to see the city's ramparts before the gloaming fell on that desolate place, I suddenly saw a long high wall of whiteness with pinnacles here and there thrown up above it, floating towards me, silent and grim as a secret, and knew it for that evil thing, the mist. The sun, though low, was shining on every sprig of heather. The green and scarlet mosses were shining with it too. It seemed incredible that in 3 minutes' time all those colours would be gone, and nothing left all round but a great darkness. I gave up hope of finding the city that day. A broader path than mine could have been quite easily lost. I hastily chose for my bed a thick patch of heather, wrapped myself in a waterproof cloak, and lay down and made myself comfortable. And then the mist came. It came like the careful pulling of lace curtains. Then, like the drawing of grey blinds, it shut out the horizon to the north, then to the east and west. It turned the whole sky white and hid the moor. It came down on it like a metropolis, only utterly silent, silent and white as tombstones. And then I was glad of that strange, strong rum, or whatever it was, in the flask that the shepherd gave me, for I did not think that the mist would clear till night, and I feared the night would be cold. So I nearly emptied the flask, and sooner than I expected I fell asleep. For the first night out, as a rule, one does not sleep at once, but is kept awake some while by the little winds and the unfamiliar sound of the things that wander at night, and that cry to one another far off with their queer faint voices. One misses them afterwards when one gets to houses again, but I heard none of these sounds in the mist that evening. And then I woke and found that the mist was gone, and the sun was just disappearing under the moor, and I knew that I had not slept for as long as I thought, and I had decided to go on while I could, for I thought that I was not very far from the city. I went on and on along the twisty track. Bits of the mist came down and filled the hollows, but lifted again at once so that I saw my way. The twilight faded as I went. The star appeared, and I was able to see the track no longer. I could go no further that night, yet before I lay down to sleep, I decided to go and look over the edge of a wide depression in the moor that I saw a little way off. So I left the track and walked a few 100 yards, and when I got to the edge, the hollow was full of mist, all white underneath me. Another star appeared, and a cold wind arose, and with the wind the mist flapped away like a curtain, and there was the city. Nothing the shepherd had said was the least untrue or even exaggerated. The poor old man had told the simple truth. There is not a city like it in the world. What he had called thin spires were minarets, but the little domes on top were clearly pure gold, as he said. There were the marble terraces he described, and the pure white palaces covered with carvings and hundreds of minarets. The city was obviously of the east, and yet where there should have been crescents on the domes of the minarets, there were golden suns with rays, and wherever one looked, one saw things that obscured its origin. I walked down to it, and, passing through a wicket gate of gold in a low wall of white marble, I entered the city. The heather went right up to the city's edge and beat against the marble wall whenever the wind blew it. Lights began to twinkle from high windows of blue glass as I walked up the white street. Beautiful copper lanterns were lit up and let down from balconies by silver chains. From doors ajar came the sound of voices singing, and then I saw the men. Their faces were rather grey than black, and they wore beautiful robes of coloured silk, with hems embroidered with gold, and some with copper, and sometimes pacing down the marble ways, with golden baskets hung on each side of them, I saw the camels of which the old shepherd spoke. The people had kindly faces, but though they were evidently friendly to strangers, I could not speak with them, being ignorant of their language, nor were the sounds of the syllables they used like any language I'd ever heard. They sounded more like grouse. When I tried to ask them by signs whence they had come with their city, they would only point to the moon, which was bright and full, and was shining fiercely on those marble ways, till the city danced in light. And now there began appearing one by one, slipping softly out through windows, men with stringed instruments in the balconies. They were strange instruments with huge bulbs of wood, and they played softly on them, and very beautifully, and their queer voices softly sang to the music weird dirges of the griefs of their native land, wherever that may be. And far off in the heart of the city others were singing too. The sound of it came to me wherever I roamed, not loud enough to disturb my thoughts, but gently turning the mind to pleasant things. Slender carved arches of marble, as delicate almost as lace, crossed and recrossed the ways wherever I went. There was none of that hurry of which foolish cities boast, nothing ugly or sordid so far as I could see. I saw that it was a city of beauty and song. I wondered how they had travelled with all that marble, how they had laid it down on Mallington Moor, whence they had come, and what their resources were, and determined to investigate closely next morning, for the old shepherd had not troubled his head to think how the city came. He had only noted that the city was there, and of course no one believed him, though that is partly his fault for his dissolute ways. But at night one can see little, and I had walked all day, so I determined to find a place to rest in. And just as I was wondering whether to ask for shelter of those silk-robed men by signs, or whether to sleep outside the walls and enter again in the morning, I came to a great archway in one of the marble houses with two black curtains, embroidered below with gold, hanging across it. Over the archway were carved, apparently in many tongues, the words, "Here strangers rest." In Greek, Latin, and Spanish the sentence was repeated, and there was writing also in the language that you see on the walls of the great temples of Egypt, and Arabic, and what I took to be early Assyrian, and one or two languages I had not seen. I entered through the curtains and found a tessellated marble court, with golden braziers burning sleepy incense swinging by chains from the roof. All round the walls were comfortable mattresses lying upon the floor covered with cloths and silks. It must have been 10 o'clock, and I was tired. Outside, the music still softly filled the streets. A man had set a lantern down on the marble way. 5 or 6 sat down round him, and he was sonorously telling them a story. Inside, there were some already asleep on the beds. In the middle of the wide court under the braziers, a woman dressed in blue was singing very gently. She did not move, but sung on and on. I never heard a song that was so soothing. I lay down on one of the mattresses by the wall, which was all inlaid with mosaics, and pulled over me some of the cloths with their beautiful alien work, and almost immediately my thoughts seemed part of the song that the woman was singing in the midst of the court under the golden braziers that hung from the high roof, and the song turned them to dreams, and so I fell asleep. A small wind having arisen, I was awakened by a sprig of heather that beat continually against my face. It was morning on Mallington Moor, and the city was quite gone.